which have been quite lively and not necessarily constructive in some cases. We have heard from various camps on the yes and no side, but I want to look now at the Referendum Commission, which is an independent body, and possibly you have read the literature from the Referendum Commission, but possibly you haven't as well. Many people have called over the last few days to say that they find reading through the document to be quite intense, and even though it's a much more simplified version of the actual text, it can be not challenging reading, but it does take time to set aside, sit down, study the issues and form an opinion on them. But we're joined by David Wadell, who is Secretary to the Referendum Commission, and he's going to try as best he can to summarise the key issues and to answer some questions that perhaps you may have relating to this. David, good morning.
Good morning to you, Will.
And thank you very much for taking time out for us. I suppose in simple terms, David, what does this treaty propose to do?
Well, the treaty, if it's ratified, would bring about some changes to how the EU is governed, and would also change a range of EU activities. And if I were to summarise them, I'd say that some decisions which currently must be taken unanimously in Europe would be taken by what's called a qualified majority vote. And those areas which would move to this majority vote would include energy, asylum, immigration, judicial cooperation and sport. Some decisions, though, would continue to be taken unanimously, such as those in defence and taxation.
Are there any areas as it stands governed by qualified majority?
Oh yes, there are. There's quite a range of areas which are currently in QMV. They're the among those would be appointment of the EU commissioners, rules relating to the protection of individuals regarding processing personal data, customs cooperation, and the big one familiar to many of your listeners, of course, would be agriculture. Freedom of workers would be another one. But I suppose one of the areas of proposed change which has received a lot of coverage is that each member state would choose an EU commissioner for just 10 out of every 15 years. So that each member state then would lose a commissioner for 5 of those 15 years. The reason for 5 is that 5 years is the cycle of the Commission. The European Parliament would be given more decision-making powers, and they're proposing a new job, the President of the European Council. The European Council is the meeting of the heads of governments, which meets approximately 4 times a year. And that council would be in future be able to propose changes to the EU treaties, which would then have to be approved by the member states.
Of course, not all these changes happen immediately, though, do they?
Oh no, not at all. For example, the reduction in the Commission, we're talking about that happening from 2014.
So what happens if the people of Ireland vote no to this treaty?
Well, if the people of Ireland vote no, if a majority of the voters vote no on Thursday, then our constitution won't be changed and Ireland will not ratify the treaty. And that treaty can only come into effect if it's ratified by all member states. So the EU then would continue to operate under its present rules.
Now, is Irish law superior to European law, regardless of what the outcome on Thursday is?
European law, in the areas in which the EU has competence, and I'm sorry to use a technical term like that, but basically competence means the areas in which the EU can make policies and laws. In those areas, EU law is superior and has been the case since we joined the European Union. Competence is the term used in the Treaty of Lisbon, for example, to describe the power that the EU has to draw up policies and laws, and the EU can only introduce policies and laws in relation to those areas that are set out in the treaties.
Okay, I want to maybe put one or two of the issues that have come up on the programme repeatedly, and from an agricultural standpoint, the veto has been mentioned on many occasions. Can you explain what a veto is?
In areas which require a unanimous vote, then if one member state says no, I'm voting no, then that can't be agreed. It's quite a rare thing to happen, because usually what happens is that there are protracted negotiations, as we've seen now with the agreement recently over the agency, the temporary workers. In relation to the World Trade Agreement, I suppose that's the one that has hit the headlines. And the Referendum Commission has issued a clarification on that. And that is that a veto on the World Trade Agreement would continue even after Lisbon is ratified if there are elements in that World Trade Agreement which still require a unanimous vote.
Under Lisbon, though, would the number of situations in which Ireland has a veto be reduced?
It would, yes. It is proposed to move a number of areas from unanimity, where we would have the veto, and introduce qualified majority voting instead. Now, the Commission has listed 23 main such areas, but it's a difficult one to itemise, because elements of a particular area can be subject to qualified majority voting, and elements can be subject to a veto. Just to run down through a few of them: the election of the President of the European Council, that would move from veto. That would involve QMV. The appointment of the High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy by the European Council. That's a new job, the so-called EU's Foreign Affairs Minister. The conclusion of a withdrawal agreement with a member state which wishes to leave the EU, that's provided for as well. But there are a number of areas where Ireland has negotiated opt-outs. So measures concerning border checks, for example, measures concerning an asylum system, and measures concerning an immigration policy, and measures concerning judicial cooperation and aspects of police cooperation. We've negotiated an opt-out in those areas, and we can opt in the future if we wish. The reason why we've chosen an opt-out in some areas involving our legal system is that the legal system in this country and in the United Kingdom is what's called the common law system, and it differs from the continental variety, which is a civil law system. I won't go into too much detail on that, Will.
Okay, will this treaty change how our Department of Finance relates to Brussels? Will we be bound, for example, to set a uniform corporation tax rate across Europe?
Well, one of the first clarifications, I suppose, that the Referendum Commission issued was that the veto would still apply to direct taxation matters, including corporation tax. Now, I'm aware that there's still an argument going on over that, and there are arguments which say that, it could be introduced by the back door, by some sort of cooperation between member states. But I'd have to point out that the Referendum Commission restricts itself to, the interpretation of the Lisbon Treaty that we're faced with voting on, and won't engage in a wider debate where issues that, may not be relevant to Lisbon itself come up.
But just on that note, if we take the text of the treaty, it is a legal document and sometimes can be difficult to read, but it seems that there's a lot of scope for interpretation within this treaty. Is it possible in the future that it may be tested, that if there's an interpretation that the Referendum Commission has taken that isn't necessarily the view held by other member states, that it may be tested in court at some point in the future?
Well, yes, as our Constitution is regularly in our courts, and it can be difficult, as anybody who's, looked at the courts, whether it's the Irish High and Supreme Court or the European Court of Justice,